I do want to share something with you today that I hope will be a help to you. We're talking to pastors today, and I know a lot of times we get together for these kinds of meetings and we feel maybe compelled to preach on some strong doctrinal point, and I know our doctrine probably as well as any of you, and I could preach it if that was what the Lord would lay upon my heart, but I want to be a help to you today. I've been pastoring for almost 36 years. I guess technically, in a sense, probably sometime next month will be my 36th anniversary. I started out filling in a little church over in Scioto County, Ohio, across the river from the Ashland area where I now pastor, which is my home, back in March of 2080. And I was sharing time with a retired minister that was there who was in very poor health. He was just a member of the church, and he and I split Sundays for probably a month or so, and he finally went to the pulpit committee and he said, I just cannot do this. He had a real bad heart condition. He said, there's times that from one day to the next, I don't know how I feel, and he said that Brother Jordan could do all the services, Sunday mornings, Sunday night, Wednesday night. I would appreciate that instead of taking a week about. So I guess sometime in April that year I started doing that, and then in June of that year they voted for me to come and be their pastor. And so actually starting the 20th of July 1980 is when I actually was my first Sunday as the official pastor, I guess. So we're approaching 36 years of ministry. During that time, I've had 5 young men that have felt a call to ministry, and have 4 of those 5 have pastored. One of them is still with me in Meade Station. 3 of those young men have gone through the process completely and been ordained. One's in the process, Trey Parsons, who's at the Grandview Church of God there in Ashland. Trey came out of our church at Meade Station. And then I have another young man in our church that's just starting the process. And I feel that someday he too probably will be in pastoral ministry somewhere. I share that with you to say this, that I've had a heart for preachers, young preachers and old preachers alike. I was a young preacher when I started, 26 when I started pastoring, and I'm 62 now, so I'm kind of one of the old guys. I was telling somebody the other day, where are you at? Oh, there you are. I told somebody the other day, if Lowell and I are getting to be 2 of the older guys that still pastoring full-time in eastern Kentucky, and I can remember when I was the kid, and now here I am, an old codger, like Lowell. Got a little bit more hair than Lowell, so But I want to share a thought with you today that I hope will be an encouragement to you. We all know how tough pastoring is today, and I've seen so many changes. We all have. Most of us in this room have been at this a while. And we deal with issues today that we would never have dreamed 35 years ago that we'd be dealing with in our churches. Things that we would never even thought about or entertained. Just let me give you an example and also a little bit of information. Actually it was back in about the week after Christmas, I guess. I have a Kentucky State policeman who's a sergeant at the Ashland Post, which is just 2.5 miles up the road from our church, that was saved and baptized since I've been at Meade Station, and he and his wife come faithfully. And it was after the shooting out in San Diego, and he came to me and he said, Brother Rob, I just have a real concern about our church. Now, the new building that we built 3.5 years ago, we've got security cameras outside, we've got security cameras different places in our building, but he said, I'm just concerned about the safety of our people in our church. We're adjacent to a 4-lane highway, US 60, that goes into Ashland, a lot of traffic, high visibility. So he had a lieutenant from his post that does this. They go into schools and churches and businesses. They'll come into your church, the Kentucky State Police will, and they will go through your building and make suggestions of how you can make your building more secure and more safe. And they focus primarily upon our children's department and things that we could do that if we'd ever have an active shooter come into the church. And I didn't know how many people would show up for this meeting. They were going to do it on a Sunday night after evening worship. And this time of year, if the weather's good, we might have 85 people on a Sunday night. We had well over 100 people come back for that service that night. They wanted to hear what these police officers had to say. And I would suggest that if you have any concerns about your church, that you invite the Kentucky State Police to come in and do that for you. But my point is this, who would ever thought, 35 years ago, who would have ever thought of having a meeting like that with the Kentucky State Police? It's wild, isn't it? Everything has changed so much. So we live in a different world, and we sometimes feel absolutely overwhelmed by what we have to do in ministry. I'm going to talk to you this morning about probably the person that we know more about than anybody else in all the Bible when you stop and think about it, and that's Moses. When you stop and think about Moses' life, I mean, we're introduced to him at the moment that he's born and placed a few weeks later into the Nile River until the time that he dies. We have a pretty good outline of his life, if you will. Really, we know more about Moses than we know about Jesus from a physical standpoint, his physical life, if you understand what I'm saying. And we know that Moses' life in so many ways is unique. I mean, from the time that he was born, and the fact that he was adopted into Pharaoh's family through his daughter, and grew up in that kind of environment. We see when he's 40 years old, he begins to realize the oppression that his native people are under, and he tries to intervene and do something. We know how that all turns out. And he's forced to flee to the backside of the desert and spends the next 40 years of his life living in exile. And then to go through the experience that he went through at the burning bush and to come face to face with, if you would, with the call of God upon his life. And how he, just like probably all of us, if we would be honest with ourselves, was so reluctant, wasn't he? You know, he tried to find every excuse in the world not to do what God wanted him to do. I don't know how it was with you. Maybe you were ready when God spoke to you, but I ran from that for months. You know, from the time God started dealing with my heart until I finally went to the altar there at Meat Station where I pastor now, in the old building. And Nell and our associate pastor, Don Dingus, was there at that time. We didn't have a pastor, came down, and I was sobbing. You couldn't have run a hot poker through my heart. I don't guess it made me cry any harder than I was crying at that altar. And he came down and said, "Rob, what in the world is going on?" You know? And I told him, I said, "I feel like God's called me to ministry." And I was scared to death of that. And yet I made a decision that night and surrendered to that call and had no idea where that would lead me, and all the places, the 4 churches that we've pastored since that time, and all the many miles that we've traveled, thousands and thousands of people that we've shook hands with, and hundreds of funerals that we've done, and I don't know how many weddings over the years, and had no idea where that journey was taking me. Well, Moses was reluctant. He was extremely reluctant as to what God wanted him to do. And yet, he finally yielded to the call, and with his brother's help, they went back to Egypt, went through all that they had to go through with Pharaoh, all the 10 plagues, and trying to battle Pharaoh on one hand and trying to convince the people of Israel that they truly were sin of God and that God really had a plan for their life, and trying to sell them on that idea. And then finally, when the day came that God delivered them, and that last and final plague of death came, and they got up and left and plundered the nation and started on their journey. You know, Moses had to think, man, he thought he had the worst of it behind him probably at that point in time. You know, he probably thought, hey, from now on, things has got to be better. Little did he know that he was really just stepping out of the frying pan into the fire, wasn't he? Got to the Red Sea, went through all of that, you know, and made it across and saw Pharaoh's armies destroyed behind them. And again, he had to be on a mountaintop and think, oh, you know, it's getting better, you know. And then God did the most unusual thing. Instead of turning north toward the promised land, he told him to turn south. You know, that just couldn't have made a whole lot of sense. You know, to Moses, you know, Lord, the promised land's north, why are we going south? And so for the next 3 months, they traveled south into the heart, almost to the southern tip, if you will, the Sinai Peninsula, till they came to Mount Sinai. And it was during that 3-month period of time that Moses began to get an idea of what kind of a congregation he had. You know, and all the grumblings and all the complainings and all the murmurings. Now, there's not a one of us here tonight or today that if we've pastored any length of time, have not grumbled or complained a little bit about the church that we've had to pastor. I was in a meeting many years ago down in Lakeville, Florida. First time I'd ever heard of John Maxwell. Of course, he's not as popular now as he was probably back in the 90s, but that was about the time he was starting to make his heyday. It was at the old Southern Convention. Jeff, did you ever attend one of those down at Lakeville, Florida? Okay, was you there at that time? And Jeff will remember this story. John Maxwell said the second church he pastored, the first church he pastored was in Hillham, Indiana. The second church he pastored was in Lancaster, Ohio. And he went to the church at Lancaster, and they were a congregation of about 150 when he went there. And he said just almost immediately, they just sprang up and they had 300 people. And that was pretty well seating capacity for their sanctuary. And he said they were constantly encouraging people that arrived a little bit earlier, instead of sitting on the edge of the pew like Brother David is down here, go to the middle of the pew, and that way latecomers have a place to come in and sit. But he said he had one old man in the church, that was his pew, and that was his seat on the pew, on the aisle end, and he wasn't going to move, he wasn't going to stand up and let anybody get past him into the part of the seat. He just sat there, and people would come up and stand beside of him on one end, and he would just stare straight ahead, just totally ignoring. John Maxwell said he was convinced at that point if God would allow you just to shoot one of your members, he said everybody would have moved to the center. And he said, you know, really and truly, we all probably have at least one member we'd like to shoot. We could envision things getting better. Now, I know already you're thinking of somebody. You've got somebody in your mind that I thought about this last night. I thought, you know, I got 4 I'd like to shoot at Meat Station right now that's just acting a little bit sideways about some things, you know. But Moses would have traded churches with you in a heartbeat. No question in my mind. Man, he had a rough bunch, didn't he? And so finally they come to Mount Sinai. And something special in store for them at Mount Sinai. And that's where I'd like to pick up our story. If you have your Bibles and would like to turn to us, I'd like to go to the 24th chapter of the book of Exodus and start reading at verse 12. And we'll read down through the end of the chapter, those 7 verses, down through verse 18. It says, And the Lord said unto Moses, Come up to me into the mount, and be there, and I will give thee tables of stone, and law, and commandments which I have written, that thou mayest teach them. And Moses rose up, and his minister Joshua, and Moses went up into the mount of God. And he said unto the elders, Tarry ye here for us, until we come again unto you, and behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man have any matters to do, let him come unto them. And Moses went up into the mount, and a cloud covered the mount. And the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And the 7th day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud. And the sight of the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on the top of the mount in the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moses went into the midst of the cloud, and gat him up into the mount. And Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. Now, what happened over those next 40 days and 40 nights was absolutely mind-boggling to Moses and to Joshua. I'm just going to thumb through my Bible and just point out to you the little headlines as the Bible that I use is divided, and realize that God gives Moses explicit instructions as to how all these things that we talk about are to be made. He begins, if you will, with the tabernacle. He talks about the wood. He talks about the different types of skins and what colors they need to be, and all those things that we go into the tabernacle. He talks about the Ark of the Testimony and how it's to be constructed. He gives dimensions and materials and all those kinds of things. He talks about the table for the shewbread. He talks about the candlestick and how they're to be beaten out of pure gold and how they're to be made. He talks about the curtains for the tabernacle and how they're to be woven and how they're to be constructed, and how all that's to be put together with the boards and the sockets that would hold all of these things into place. He talks about the altar where the sacrifice would be offered and how it's to be constructed. He talks about the court and all the dimensions of the court and how it's to look and how it's to appear. He talks about the oil for the lamps and how it's to be beaten out of the pure olive oil and the significance of all of that. Then he gets into the garments that Aaron and his sons are to wear in the priesthood, and how they're to be constructed, what they're to be made of, how they are to appear. He talks about the ephod. He talks about the breastplate that will accompany those garments. And then he talks about the other holy garments that they will use in the ministration, if you will, of their duties. Then he talks about the consecration of the priests and how they're to be consecrated, how the oil is to be applied, and all the different things to their body, and how they're to be prepared for service. He talks about the daily offering and what it's to consist of, and how it's to be offered. He talks about the altar of incense, where the incense would be offered unto the Lord. He talks about the atonement money and what it's to be used for, and how it's to be done. The brass of laver, the holy anointing oil that they would use, and again, in the administration of their offering. And then he talks finally about the holy perfume that they would use, and how it's to be administered in the exercise of their offering. Now, when you read that, if you take the time and sit down and read all of that, I don't know about you, but that blows my mind. I mean, to think that they would have to scribe all this down. Joshua was his secretary. Joshua was trying to record all this, to scribe all this down. And the thing that has to be going through Moses' head. Now, he's the leader. He's the one that God has called to the top of the mountain. God's giving him all these instructions. And it has to be going through Moses' mind, how in the world am I supposed to do all this? How am I ever supposed to make all of this happen? Now, all of us here today that have pastored realizes that there are times that what we feel called upon or compelled to do as a pastor is absolutely overwhelming to us. And so oftentimes we fall into the trap of thinking, well, because I'm the pastor, it's my job to do. And a lot of us allow ourselves to fall into a deeper hole than that, and we think, well, nobody else can do it like I can do it or as good as I can do it. And then we wonder why so many pastors today struggle in ministry. We wonder why so many pastors today are burnt out and quit. You know, guys quit at early ages sometimes, or just absolutely burnt out because of all the weight of responsibility that they feel upon their shoulders. And so, oftentimes we feel absolutely overwhelmed, and with that sense of being overwhelmed, we feel so inadequate that we literally have all the joy that we used to have for ministry, and all the enthusiasm, all the excitement that we used to have, every bit of that gets sucked out of us. And we find ourselves going through the motions, doing the best that we know how to do, but never really feel like we're accomplishing anything for God. Never really feel like that we're no longer making a difference like we once thought we were making in people's lives. And instead of having a joy in the thing that we're doing, it almost becomes a dread to us at times to think, oh no, I've got another surgery to attend. Oh no, I've got another funeral to do. Oh no, I've got another meeting to go to. Oh no, I've got another crabby person on the phone that wants to talk to me first thing in the morning, or you're sitting in your office, and I was bivocational in my first church, and I try to keep a little bit of time at the church just in case somebody didn't want to come by and talk to me. I lived in Ashland, was pastoring in Franklin Furnace, so I lived about 19 miles or so from the church, and I try to make myself available a couple of days a week, maybe for a couple hours in the evening, and you see a certain car pull in the parking lot through your window, you go, oh no, not him again. I don't need him today, We've all been there. We've all had that. But I want you to notice that after God had given Moses all these instructions, after He'd given him all this intricate detail, that we come to chapter 31. And chapter 31 is where the answer is for Moses. And so I want you, if you would, to turn with me to chapter 31 for just a moment. And let's begin reading at verse 1. It says, And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, See, I have called by name Bezaleel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, and wisdom, and an understanding, and knowledge, and all manner of workmanship, to devise cunning works, to work in gold, and in silver, and in brass, and in cutting of stones, to set them, and in carving of timber, to work in all manner of workmanship. And behold, I have given with him Aholiab, the son of Ahishamach, of the tribe of Dan, and in the hearts of all that are wise-hearted I have put wisdom, that they may make all that I have commanded thee. The tabernacle of the congregation, the ark of the testimony, the mercy seat that is thereupon, and all the furniture of the tabernacle, and a table and his furniture, and a pure candlestick with all his furniture, and the altar of incense, and the altar of burnt offering with all his furniture, and the laver with his foot, and the clothes of service, and the holy garments for Aaron the priest, and the garments of his sons to minister in the priest's office, and the anointing oil, and the sweet incense for the holy place, according to that all I have commanded thee shall they do. Now here Moses from chapter 24 through all of chapter 30 is wondering, who in the world is going to do this? How in the world am I ever going to accomplish this? How am I ever going to get this done? But before God ever called Joshua and Moses up to the top of the mountain in chapter 24, He had Bezaleel and Aholiab already in mind. Not only did He have them in mind to do the things that need to be done, but He had a whole host of other people that would support them and assist them and help them in getting the work done that needed could be done. You see, God had people right in the very congregation that Moses was pastoring, that he had already equipped and was preparing to do the work of the ministry that, we'll use the term, the church needed to be doing. It wasn't going to fall all upon Moses' shoulders, or Joshua's shoulders, or Aaron's shoulders, or his son's shoulders, but God had a whole group of people already lined up and waiting to do the work of ministry that would need to be done. And all Moses would need to do was just give supervision, to give oversight of what these men would be doing. And if you continue on with the story, once they get past the molten calf and all that, if you get into the story to where these things finally start to be constructed, and offerings are required to provide all these materials, you realize that the people were so glad to do their part. They felt so involved in what was going on that they brought so much that at one point in time Moses had to say, we don't need any more materials. We don't need any more cloth, or we don't need any more gold. We have enough. The people were excited to do it, but they had to be given the opportunity to do what God had called them to do. I want you to indulge me, if you might, for just a few moments. I'm glad Jeff's here today, because he'll remember this story too that John Maxwell told, and this has always stuck with me. John Maxwell talked in that conference. One of the things he talked to us about that week was the fact that so many of us feel like we have to be a super pastor. And Jeff, if you remember, he had a sport coat on and a golf shirt, and he took that coat off and he put it on his head like a cape. You might remember that. And we were in a conference center, and they just had chairs sitting up, and they were closer than this front pew, and he jumped off that platform with this coat on his head that looked like a cape, and he acted like he's flying like Superman. He jumped off the platform onto those front set of chairs. Now, he weighed probably 100 pounds less than I do now, so I wouldn't even try that, certainly the way I am now. But he said, so many of us are like super pastor. We get a call, somebody's in the hospital, or there's something going on in somebody's home, and we think, nobody can do what I can do. Nobody can pray for that person like I can pray for that person. I have to be there for all these different things. And he said, then we wonder why we burn ourselves out. Then we wonder why we get so discouraged with ministry. And I think a lot of us fall into that trap. I've got really, really good friends in ministry that have definitely fallen into that trap. And they think that they're the only ones that can do ministry. They think they're the only ones that can do God's work within the local congregation. That everything that happens has to go through them, and nobody else should even touch what needs to be done because that's their business. I'm the pastor. I'll take care of that. And I'll do that. Because you see, the problem is that's not the biblical design for the church.
Amen.
The biblical design of the church is for the pastor to give oversight. For the pastor to be the prayer warrior, if you would. For the pastor to be the preacher, the teacher, the instructor. But the biblical design of the local church is for the church to be involved in ministry. Now, that's not to say we absolve ourselves of all ministry. There's probably none of you in here that visit any more than I do, that attend to those types of things, pastoral duties, any more than I do. But yet, over the years, I've learned a hard lesson. That I am cheating myself, and I'm cheating my congregation if I don't allow the church to be the church.
Amen.
Let me tell you a little bit about my life story. I told you I went to Franklin Furnace. Am I going to mess up if I step away from that? Maybe not. Let's turn this thing over here. I spent 4 years at Franklin Furnace, a bivocational pastor, and felt really that God wants to go into full-time ministry. And it was just an act of God, the way it worked out. We ended up in Concord, North Carolina. We took a church there that had gone through 2 consecutive splits. The first guy that split the church had got involved with the tongues movement. And he took 100 people with him, went across town, built a metal building, had a congregation of people there of 100, 120 people, and they were doing their thing. And then about 4 years later, the guy that followed him, about 4 years later came, he split the church and went 10 blocks up the same street where the church was, and rented a storefront, and took about 50 people with him, and started the second church. Now, they wanted to still continue to be aligned with the Church of God, but they were split off of the old church, and so that left about 60 people or so at the old church. And so we went there and spent almost 10 years there. I still hold the record, and I'm convinced that I'll die with the record of the longest tenure of any pastor of that church. I was the 27th pastor that they'd had in 54 years. Wow. 27th pastor in 54 years. They started in 1930. I went there in 1984, and I was the 27th pastor. That's quite a track record, isn't it? Forrest Plants, who was pastoring at Hickory at that time, called me, and he didn't know me. He said, Brother Jordan, I'm Forrest Plants, and I pastor in Hickory. He was chairman of the Credentials Board in the state at that time, and we just wanted to get some information off him. He said, do you have any idea what you're getting into? And I said, well, I think so. And I'd never heard this term before. He said, Brother Jordan, that church is a preacher eater. Never heard that term before. But we went there, and I had a pastor tell me that had been there to hold a revival, Jim Rainey, who's now deceased. He said, Brother Jordan, if you go to Concord, you'll have to love those people when they're unlovable if you're going to stay. The best advice I've ever gotten in ministry. You'll have to love those people when they're unlovable. We stayed 10 years. But during that 10 years, I had fallen into this trap. During that 10 years, it was not unusual for me to make over 600 calls a year. We went through 2 building programs when I was there, and I tried to give oversight to all that. I worked hundreds and hundreds of hours on the second building because the men did most of that. We built a 12,000 square foot family life center and gave literally hundreds of hours to that in the evenings and on Saturdays. Took time away from my wife and my 2 little boys and really just dedicated myself to that task. I started having health problems, passing blood through my intestines and having all kinds of health problems. My wife one time had her bags packed up and had called her mom from Kentucky, and she came to take her and the kids. She said, I can't live like this. And that was an eye-opening experience. That's a different story for another time. That was what really started bringing some ideas that I had to do things differently in my life and in my ministry. But I had a young man who was a professor at UNC Charlotte, which is just 10 miles or so from our church, that came to me one day. It was near the end of my ministry there, and he knew I was struggling. Man, he knew I was out of ideas. 10 years, I had exercised every idea that I had. I was out of ideas. And he said, Rod, you're trying to do all of this yourself. And I said, well, Brett, I can't get anybody to do anything. Nobody wants to do anything. Anybody ever preached that sermon? There you have. And he said, Rod, what you need to do is you just need to have a meeting ask anybody in the church that has an interest in our church, come and just let people brainstorm ideas. Let people share ideas of different things that maybe they'd like to see done in the church or outreach in the community and all that kind of stuff. And I turned a deaf ear to that. That was my last summer there. I turned a deaf ear to that. I thought, these people don't have any ideas. Nobody wants to do anything. Nobody even come to a meeting like that. And I ended up resigning and leaving. And I went to Ohio. I went there to a church who the pastor prior to me had an open affair with a woman in the church. They were caught together in adultery. And of course, he ended up having to resign, lost his credentials. Was there 5 months and found out that the church treasurer had been the treasurer there for about 14 years, had embezzled thousands and thousands of dollars from the church. I mean, you're talking about a mess. That was an absolute mess. But early on, I kept hearing what Brett Wood had told me in North Carolina. And after I'd been there maybe a year or so, I thought, I'm going to try what Brett. And I had been involved in those kinds of things. In state ministry, we'd done that. Some of you maybe remember here a few years ago, I was asked by the state to chair a committee. We did long-range planning, and that's how that all came out, was really from this idea that Brett Wood had given me years ago. But we started every other year, we'd have a meeting with our church. We'd ask our church leaders to come, and we would sit down, and we would brainstorm, and we'd do spreadsheets. And some of you have seen me do that. I've been in your churches, and we've done that. And we would brainstorm, and we would talk about ideas. And what came out of that was, what I learned from that experience is that I had all kinds of Bezalels, I can't say his name, in the Oliabs in my congregation that I did not know. If I would have looked over my congregation, and after I'd been there for a couple of years and began to assess, well, this person would be good at that, and this person would be good at that, and this person would be good at that, you want to know something? At least 50% of those guesses would have been wrong. I had people sitting in my church that I had no idea had the passion or the talent that some of my people had. I had 3 young couples in that church that absolutely revolutionized that church. And two of those couples, husbands and wives, were saved while I was there. 2 of those men were called to ministry. 2 of those men were ordained and pastored. One's pastoring Worcester First Church of God, and one just left a church over in Youngstown just recently. He's kind of like Jesse. He's kind of between churches right now, but did a great job of pastoring a small church over in the Youngstown area. If you would have looked at those people, if you looked at those husbands and wives, you'd have thought they had nothing to offer. But as it turned out, they turned out to be the best workers that church had. I mean, they got involved. They rolled up their sleeves. they worked, they did anything you wanted to do. You could announce anything needed to be done for church, and they were usually the first 4 people that would show up at the church and say, how can we help? What do we need to do? How can we assist? You see, friends, we do ourselves a disservice in ministry by trying to think that the whole weight of the church rests upon us. And not only do we do ourselves a disservice, but we do our church a disservice by not recognizing that God is not just working in our hearts, but God is working in the hearts of other men and women in your congregation. God already probably has people in your church that maybe has never been given an opportunity. They may be like those 2 couples were. These couples were extremely quiet, reserved, withdrawn people. But once they were given the opportunity to serve, they blossomed. And they were such a blessing to that church and such a blessing to me as a pastor. And so what happened was, in the 9.5 years I was there, once we started implementing some of these ideas, when we would meet and have those planning meetings, we would kind of have a calendar for the next 2 years to work by. The Board of Trustees knew what they needed to do. The Church Council knew what they needed to do. The CE Board knew what they needed to do. These were the things that the church liked to see happen. And my job became so much easier than it had ever been before. Man, I was pulling my hair out in 10 years in Concord. And then I realized that if I would have listened to that young man, I might have still been at Concord. I very well could have still been there had I just taken the time to listen to a young man, probably in his 20s at that time, late 20s, when he came and had a burden for his pastor, and I turned him away. So we come to where we are now. We've been there almost 13 years. This June will be there 13 years. And some of you know the story there. You know, we took a church that was less than half its size what it had been 10 years prior to that. I had 3 factions that were fighting. I called Charles Irvin, who had been the pastor there when the church was at its strongest, and Brother Irvin lives down in Alabama, and I called Brother Charles, and I said, Brother Charles, the church at Meade Station has asked me to come and consider being the pastor. You know, what say you? And this is the words he told me. He said, Rob, you're the only man that I know that can go there and stop the bleeding. He said, if you don't go there, that church will disintegrate and it'll die. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. But the thing that I did know once I got there is that I had the respect of all 3 factions. They wouldn't fight me. They might fight one another, but they wouldn't fight me. And so I realized when I went there, I was kind of on, in a tenuous situation maybe. I was kind of on shaky ground, so to speak. But we believed with all of our heart that God had us to come there to that church. The first week I was there, we bought 43 acres of property. I had them $240,000 in debt garden before the end of the first week. You know, but God blessed us. In 3.5 years, we paid that off. And since that time, we've sold about 20 acres of that. We built a $1.7 million worship facility. It's a multi-use facility. They have provisions in mind that someday to build a sanctuary that will adjoin that. April the 1st, the first day of April, we owe a little over $3,000 on that building. My treasurer will write the last check, and that building will be paid off in 3.5 years. Now, that's a God thing, folks. Rob didn't have anything to do with that. But I tell you who did have a lot to do with it. I did the same thing there. I came in, I started having these meetings every other year. We have these meetings with our church leaders. I invite all my church leaders and their spouses to come. We have lunch. We talk about things. When Robbie Hefner's been with me, and I was hoping Robbie could be here today. Bob Hefner's son Robbie's with me. He's been with me 4 weeks now as youth pastor. His first Sunday there, and I didn't know they were going to do this, they had a workers' appreciation service, the CE Board did. And they handed out certificates of participation, I think, to like 37 or 38 people that morning. And Robbie and Tara sat back there watching all that, and they've come from a church in Princeton that they told me, said, you know, there's just 3 or 4 of us that does everything in a church. And after that service, both of them came up to me and said, Brother Jordan, how did you get all these people involved? I mean, how do all these people get involved in all these different things that go on in our church? We have a Wednesday children's program where we had 74, 76 kids 2 Wednesday nights ago. These are kids off the street. It's a program that we do before our evening service actually begins. And most of those kids stay for our children's ministry and our youth. It's kind of a feeder program into our youth group. And how do you get all these people to do that? I said, I didn't do anything. We let the people talk about what they wanted their church to be. And then we talked about how can we make that happen. And different people say, well, I'll do this and I'll do that. And I had just enough good sense to get out of everybody's way. I've been there 13 years. You cannot believe what little bit I do know about our church. Because I don't stick my nose in everything that's going on. I tell my people, if you got a problem, you come and see me. If I hear of a problem, I'm going to come and see you. And if neither one of those two things happen, I'm happy and you can be happy. And I let the church be the church. Guys, I've been at this a long time. And it would have been extremely, extremely easy for me to quit in 1993 when I left Concord. I was so burnt out. I was so frustrated. I was at wit's end. It took me 2 or 3 years being in Alliance before I could really start to feel like a pastor again. To where I really started to enjoy, especially what I inherited, that I could really start to enjoy doing ministry again. But it wasn't until I heard the words of that young man in my church in Concord and took those words to heart and realized that I had suffocated my people. To realize that I had not let the church be the church. I'd never given them an opportunity to express their voice. Every idea that was put forth was my idea. I never let anybody else speak. I never let anybody else have any responsibility of leadership. But once I realized that God had Bezalels, I can't say that name again, and Holahabs out there, until I realized that those people were already in that church, I just didn't know who they were. I've got a real good idea. Moses had no idea who these guys were. I mean, he might have known who they were, but he had no idea the talents they possessed. Amen. He had no idea what God had planted in their hearts and their minds. Right. And so I come to you today as a pastor, talking to pastors, and some of you may be discouraged, and some of you might be hurting. You say, well, Brother Jordan, I don't have as many people as you have. We've only got 30 people, or 40 people, or 50 people. Let me tell you something. If you've just got 1 or 2 people that's sitting on the sidelines, and it may be somebody that you would never dream in your wildest dreams would. If you can meet Jack and Melody Rubel, if you'd see them, and I'm not talking about, I'm not disparaging their appearance or anything. They're clean people. They're neat people. But if you just see them and come in and sit down in your church and you think, well, all those 2 people would ever be are people warmers. They're the 2 workingest people that God has ever put in my path. I mean, Jack and Melody, you wouldn't believe. But if you look at them, you'd have passed over them, you'd have never thought one time to ask them to do anything in the church. You have no idea what you might have in your congregation today. But if you'll dare to trust God, if you'll dare to give people an opportunity to serve and minister, it can make your ministry better. It'll make the ministry of your church better. And if you want to reach your community, do you know who can reach your community better than anybody? The people in your community. Sure. And so I just want to leave that with you today. I know I'm preaching to the choir this morning. I probably haven't said anything that you haven't heard. I maybe haven't said anything that you've not been doing for years. I'm a slow learner. You might say, well, Brother Rob, I've been doing that for 40 years. God bless you. It took me a while to learn that. But I hope today that maybe we've said something that will encourage you and will help you. And help you to see revival come to your church. Help you to see new faces and to see growth come to your church. And to see new programs maybe started that you never dreamed of. There may be needs in your community that you've never thought about, but other people have been sitting back for years and never said anything that, it'd be nice if our church would do this, that, or the other. And let me tell you something else, and I'll finish with this. I'm a firm believer that you don't need to do a lot of things halfway. If you can find 2 or 3 things to do in your community that nobody else is doing them and doing them really, really good, you'll be amazed at the difference you can make in your community. This Wednesday night program that we're doing was a brainchild of a lady in our church who has since stepped aside, and her niece is actually running it now. But it was to minister to kids in our community, many who live with one parent, many who live with neither parent, that never have anybody to ever teach them how to sew, that would never teach them how to play a piano or a guitar, that would never take the time to show a little boy how to run a power saw or a drill, make a birdhouse. What we do, the schools let us go in and promote this because it doesn't have anything to do with Christianity, so to speak. What we do is teach them life skill lessons. They've taught kids how to decorate cakes. You'd be amazed at some of the things these kids have sewn. You'd be amazed at some of these kids that have learned to play a guitar. Things that parents used to teach their kids, but they don't have parents to teach them, or the parents don't have time to teach them. And these kids flock to this. We feed them a full meal every Wednesday before church. That's the last thing they do before we dismiss that program. And the ones that want to stay can stay for youth or stay for children's programs. Like I said, 2 Wednesday nights. I wasn't there this Wednesday because I had the flu, but 2 Wednesday nights ago, I think we had 74, 76 kids. And most of these are kids just from the community. Now, we're a rural church. We're not in town. We're on the edge of town, but we would be considered a rural church, and these are just kids that their parents drop off on Wednesday nights. Now that's probably the one single biggest program that we do to our community, but we do it better than anybody else could ever do it, I'll tell you that. I've got people that have a heart for it. And it's made a difference, and people across that community know who the Meat Station Church of God is because of the ministry that we have for our children. Find something that nobody else is doing, that God would give you and your people a passion and a heart for, and do that to the glory of God, to the best of your ability, whatever it might be. And you'd be amazed at the people that you've got sitting in your pews that maybe have never done anything in the church that'll make a difference like you won't believe. Let's pray if we might. Our Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for this